evening, and welcome to the Los Angeles World Affairs Council and Town Hall. I'm Rachel Kinderdine, Community Manager and Digital Producer. Tonight, we join Dan Schnur for the Dan Schnur Political Report. Dan's topic tonight is immigration and abortion, which issue will decide the 2024 election. For those of you who would like to submit questions for Dan, there's a Q&A button at the bottom of the screen where you can type in your questions. I'll be managing those during the Q&A segment, which should start in about 35 minutes. Dan, we're looking forward to another great discussion, so I'll hand it over to you.
Oh, Rachel, thanks so much. And thanks to all of you, as always, for being willing to join us for these conversations. Believe it or not, the 2024 presidential election has arrived. The Iowa caucuses are now between 6 and 7 months away, and the first Republican primary debates are scheduled in just over 2 months in August. They'll begin. This week alone, as most of you have read, there are 3 new candidates entering the race, including former Vice President Mike Pence, who will announce his candidacy tomorrow in a televised town hall. And today, former New Jersey Governor Chris Christie, who seems to be taking on the role of Tony Soprano of the primary season, announced his candidacy too. Now, last month, we talked about a couple of issues that I felt were important but might get overlooked in this election. Today, as Rachel mentioned, I want to talk about 2 topics, the issues of abortion, the issues of immigration. They're obviously very high profile, but I think the issues that I think are going to play an even more impactful role in this year's election. And once I've outlined my thoughts on those, of course, we'll be eager to hear your thoughts and your questions in the second portion of our program. Now, last month, in addition to a couple of lower profile issues, I also offered you what I would consider to be a very primary guideline, the 2024 election. And what we talked about at the beginning of May, just as a reminder, is I offered you the following. I said that, in my opinion at least, that Joe Biden is the only Democrat who can beat Donald Trump. And that Donald Trump is the only Republican who Biden can beat. So before we get on to the issues that we'll be talking about today, what I'd like to do is stop for a couple of minutes, and I'd ask Katie to join me in just a moment to see whether you agree with those 2 statements, whether Biden is the only Democrat who can beat Trump. Am I right or wrong about that? And is Trump the only Republican who Biden can beat? Do you agree or disagree with me on that one too? So let's do some comparing to see how many of us are in agreement. And so, Katie, if I can ask you to put up the first, even more basic question for our group to consider. And this obviously is predictive, but we'll be interested in hearing what everyone's mindset is at this very early stage of the campaign. Pretty simple here. Who do you believe would win an election between Biden and Trump? Biden or Trump are 2 options. No ties, no neithers, no third-party candidates. So let us know what we have as a starting place. And then what we'll do over the months is we'll come back to this question on a fairly regular basis to see if your opinions and your predictions have changed. So Katie, what did we get for this first basic question to start with? Wow, look at that. Wow. 92% of our group believes that Biden will win the election next year if he's running against Donald Trump. Only 8% say that former President Trump will win. And because, as we know, this question was designed to be a prediction, not a preference, that's pretty instructive. But now, if we can, Katie, let's dig into the questions that I just raised. And if you can put up the second question for this group. Do you agree or disagree with me on this one? This group has already established pretty strongly that they think that Biden would defeat Trump. Now let me ask you, do you agree with me that Trump is the only candidate who Biden can beat? So what I'd like you to do is check which of these other candidates would Biden defeat. if it's just one of if it's just one of the three, and obviously there's about a dozen candidates running, but our technological limitations restrict us to picking just 5 options here. If you think one of the 3 options that we've listed, Ron DeSantis, Nikki Haley, or Tim Scott, would be beaten by Biden, then of course you should vote there. If you think that 2 or 3 of them, Biden would beat all of them too, then give us that 4th option. If you don't think that Biden could beat any of them, then of course click on none of them. And so, Katie, how did we do for this one? Very interesting. It looks like our group very strongly disagrees with me. 72%, almost 3/4 of our group, believes that at least 2 of those 3, if not all of them, DeSantis, Haley, and Scott, would all lose to Biden. Only, I'd say it was about 15% total, think that just one of them could. But interestingly, only 13% agree with my assessment on this, which is that Trump would be the only Republican who Biden could beat. So I'm pretty unpopular in this room, at least on this question. Let's go on to the next one and see if I do any better. All right, so let's look at the converse of this. Which other Democrat could beat Trump? Let's say, for the sake of argument, that President Biden, for health-related or for any other reasons, decided not to run. The question is, and we've picked 3 of many potential Democrats, should that be the case, do you think that Kamala Harris could beat Trump? Do you think that Pete Buttigieg, the Secretary of Transportation, could beat Trump? Do you think Gavin Newsom, our governor out here in California, could beat Trump? If you think just one of them could, then click on that person's name. If you think that 2 or all of them, 2 or 3 of them, would all beat Trump, then click on that 4th option. And if you think that Trump would beat any of those other 3, then click on that 5th option, none of them. And so, Katie, how did we do on this one? What did our group have to say? Wow. I would not have predicted that. 48%, roughly half of our group, thinks that no other Democrat could beat Trump, at least none of these 3. And we're going to assume, for the sake of argument, that if you don't think that Harris or Buttigieg or Newsom could beat Trump, that there's not another mystery Democrat lurking out there who could. But almost half of our group says that Biden is the only Democrat who could beat Trump, which is the point that I made earlier. 20% think that at least 2, if not all of them, could beat him. And interesting, very interesting, of the 3 names that we did list, look at that. 25% of you, 1/4 of you, believe that Newsom could beat Trump, but that neither Buttigieg or Harris could. Only 6% think that Pete Buttigieg could beat Trump, and only 2% believe that Vice President Harris, if she were the Democratic nominee, would defeat Trump in a general election. Anyway, there's all sorts of other hypothetical matchups, and we'll explore those in the months ahead. But for today, it's a pretty interesting beginning point. And I'd say the fact that the group agrees with me that Biden is the only Democrat who can beat Trump, we've got a pretty good, not a consensus there, but I've got pretty good support there. But for those of you, as far as the question, whether Biden could beat other Republicans, our group very strongly disagrees with me. Anyway, so that was my last month's guideline. Biden's the only Democrat who could beat Trump. Trump is the only Republican who Biden can beat. Let's go on to this week's guideline, or this month's guideline, and this relates directly to the issues that we're going to be talking about today. So here's the guideline I'll offer you for June. Number 1, the abortion issue is political poison for Republicans. Number 2, the immigration issue is just as toxic for Democrats. So we'll talk about both, but let's start with abortion. We're coming up on the 1-year anniversary, if you can believe it. We're coming up on the 1-year anniversary of the overturn of Roe versus Wade. And I feel like we are still in the process of coming to understand the dramatic impact that the Dobbs decision has had on the nation's political landscape. Now, for most of the 21st century, for most of the last generation or so, when polls ask the American people whether they consider themselves pro-choice or pro-life, the responses have been split fairly evenly within a few percentage points in one direction or the other. But what we've also seen for many years now is that when we ask people not if they're pro-choice or pro-life, but how important the issues of abortion and judicial appointments are to their vote for president, conservative voters generally say that the issue of abortion and the topic of judicial appointments, conservatives tend to say that those issues are much more important to them than Democrats have. And even in 2020, after Trump appointed Amy Coney Barrett to the court, right after Ruth Bader Ginsburg's death, in the weeks before the 2020 election, exit polls showed that a lot more Republicans than Democrats mentioned the issues of abortion and judicial appointments as the primary motivation for their voting. But since the Dobbs decision was issued last year, removing the nationwide protection for legal abortions, the balance between pro-choice and pro-life voters has shifted dramatically from being roughly even to very, very strongly in favor of abortion rights supporters. Between 15 and 20% of the American public, which had identified as pro-life, now say that they're pro-choice. And what seems to have happened is that after the court acted, a lot of voters no longer regarded abortion as a purely philosophical question, but rather as a much more practical one. And knowing that their preferences could have real-world impact, a lot of voters moved to support abortion rights after having previously called themselves pro-life. Now, it's important to note that most voters, again, according to public opinion polling, most voters do want to see some restrictions on abortion in place. Polls show that the electorate has settled on roughly, and emphasize the word roughly, settled on roughly a 15-week threshold for states. A longer period begins to engender more opposition, as does a shorter period. So roughly 15 weeks, it's about a first trimester threshold. But what's been really interesting and very impactful is the way the two parties have responded on this new landscape. Democratic candidates have very quickly embraced an unadulterated pro-choice position. Republicans, though, on the other hand, have become caught up in all sorts of internal debates within their party about whether or not to enact a national ban on abortion, how strict the limits should be at a state level, what exceptions there should be for abortion. And so what's happened, while the Democrats have been delivering a very clear and unified message, and Republicans have been much more fractured, what happened is the Democrats escaped what looked to otherwise have been an all-out disaster in last year's midterm elections, doing much better in last November's races than a lot of people expected. And since then, they've won significant victories in special elections and ballot initiatives on historically conservative turf in very deep red states all across the country. So this has not been going well for Republicans at all. Now, some Republicans are trying to find safer ground. Nikki Haley, the former United Nations ambassador who's now running for president, delivered a speech earlier this spring in which she called for a more collaborative and less confrontational approach on the issue. And that didn't have a lot of takers on either side. But on the other hand, we've seen pro-life legislators in conservative states like South Carolina and Nebraska who voted against more strict pro-life bills in their states sponsored by their own party because of their concern about the pro-life movement overreaching. And just last week, the conservative Republican governor of Nevada, Joe Lombardo, signed a bill providing new abortion protections for out-of-state patients. But those are still pretty isolated examples. And now that the presidential election is beginning to heat up, the Republican field of candidates is really struggling with this issue, whether to talk about it and what to say about it. Now, Trump, as many of you know, greatly offended pro-life voters after the elections in November when he suggested that the Dobbs decision may have contributed to Republican defeats in House and Senate races. And the pro-lifers did not like that at all. And more recently, Trump has indicated that the 6-week abortion ban that Ron DeSantis signed into law in Florida is too strict. Now, DeSantis, for his part, did talk about that 6-week ban on his trip to Iowa last week. And because Iowa has caucuses rather than a primary, and polling shows that roughly 2/3 of Republican caucus goers, identify as evangelicals or fundamentalists or other types of religious conservatives. So in front of that audience, DeSantis talked about the 6-week ban. But otherwise, when he's campaigned in New Hampshire and in other states around the country, he avoids the abortion topic to every degree possible. And with the exception of Haley's speech that I mentioned earlier, former Vice President Mike Pence is the only Republican candidate who talks about abortion unless specifically asked. And of course, Pence's prospects rest almost entirely on support from evangelical Christians. But otherwise, the field is pretty much staying away from the issue. And the honest truth is they're not quite sure how to talk about it. But simply pretending that the abortion issue doesn't exist is not a sustainable strategy, at least not for a serious candidate. And so it's going to be very difficult for any Republican candidate not to be dragged to the right in the primaries by the need to attract conservative voters. And it's going to be even harder for whoever emerges as the nominee, whether Trump or anyone else, to pivot for a general election with a sufficiently reassuring message for swing voters, especially the married suburban women whose votes have played such an outsized role in key swing states in recent elections. In other words, in order to win a Republican primary, it's entirely possible that the nominee is going to have to take positions that make swing voters reject that candidate in the fall. So add all that up, and it seems to me that you got an issue that's going to do great damage to the Republican Party and its candidates between now and next November. But I've been talking about this for a while, so let's, Katie, if we can, let's take the question back to our group and see what they think. Question I'd like to ask all of you is how much do you think, how will the abortion issue impact Republican candidates next year? Do you think it'll hurt Republicans very badly? Do you think it'll hurt, but not greatly, just only slightly? Do you think the abortion issue will have no effect, that it'll be a wash, hurting with pro-choice voters perhaps and helping with pro-life voters? Or do you think it might help? Do you think this issue could end up helping Republicans by motivating their base a little bit? Or, as some conservatives believe, do you think it's an issue that will help Republicans quite a bit by motivating their base to turn out, as has been the case in past elections? So, Katie, how do we do on this one? What does our group have to say? Well, look at that. Very interesting. 90, more than 90%, 93% of our group thinks that the abortion issue will hurt the Republicans next year. So I may have lost our group earlier questions, but on this one, we're very much in sync. More than half think it will hurt very badly, which I think is correct. 37% are being a little bit more cautious about it. Less than 10% say either no effect or that it's an issue that will help Republican candidates. So let's do this now. Before the Democrats in the room, and I know there's a few of you, before the Democrats in the room get too carried away, let's look at what I consider the Democratic Party's Achilles heel to be in the 2024 election. And that, of course, is the issue of immigration. So let's back up a little bit. Earlier this spring, when Biden announced his candidacy for re-election, and right after Biden announced that he was going to seek another 4 years, he made two notable decisions, which I believe have the potential to very profoundly affect his prospects for 2024. First, Biden, immediately after the announcement, announced his campaign manager, a very smart and well-regarded young woman by the name of Julie Chavez Rodriguez. And Julie Chavez Rodriguez is the granddaughter of the late organized labor leader, Cesar Chavez. He announced Julie Chavez Rodriguez would be his campaign manager. And we'll come back to that in just a moment. But a few days later, about 3 days after announcing Rodriguez, Biden's Defense Department confirmed that the U.S. military was deploying active duty troops, 1,500 troops, in fact, to the U.S.-Mexico border. Now, these are two very different actions that send two very different messages. But I would suggest to you that whichever one of these two is remembered longer could end up determining the outcome of next year's election. And let me explain why I think that. So Rodriguez, like I said, is very well regarded in political circles in both parties. She was the deputy campaign manager for Biden's campaign in 2020. She's been the director of the White House Department of Intergovernmental Affairs ever since, dealing with elected officials, local and state elected officials across the country for the last 3 years. She's a very respected and skilled political operative. And make no mistake about it, she would have been a smart choice to run Biden's campaign, regardless of her gender, her ethnicity, or her family. But by naming a Latina, especially one who began attending rallies with her grandfather when she was still in grade school, well, that sends a very powerful message to the key Latino voter bloc. And this is a voter group with which Biden has struggled to some degree in the past. If you remember in the 2020 primary, Bernie Sanders outworked Biden's campaign for Latino support. And then in the general election, Trump made very significant gains among Latino voters. And a lot of leaders in that community felt that Biden and his campaign didn't give them sufficient time and attention and didn't spend enough time talking about their priorities. And one school of thought is that naming Rodriguez as his top campaign advisor is an important step toward addressing those concerns and building back Biden's support among Latino and Latina voters. But for most voters don't know who a candidate's campaign manager is or who the staff or advisors are. For most voters, policy outweighs personnel. And it's important to note that immigration is not the most important issue to most Latino voters, but it still carries a tremendous amount of symbolic, and substantive real-world importance for a community that, it could be argued, is most greatly impacted by changes in U.S. border and naturalization policy. So when the Biden administration lifted the so-called Title 42 restrictions a few weeks ago, these were the pandemic era emergency health asylum prohibition that the Trump administration put in place in 2020, in 2020, and that Biden continued after becoming president, much to the consternation of many other Democrats. But when the Biden finally lifted the Title 42 restrictions, media accounts started to talk about a situation in which thousands of migrants have been gathering just south of the U.S.-Mexico border, where they're waiting for protection, for guidance on how to proceed. Now, the Title 42 mandate required that those seeking asylum would be automatically sent back across the border into Mexico for COVID-related health reasons. And a lot of Democrats and a lot of other Americans felt that continuing to impose those restrictions, even after most of the COVID-era rules had been lifted in society, was simply an excuse to keep control of the border. And that caused a lot of anger toward Biden from the progressive wing of his own party. But the Title 42 mandate also didn't impose any long-term penalty for those who were stopped while they were trying to cross. In other words, once they got sent back, they could simply try to come over again. And one of the things we saw at the end of the Trump administration and for the last couple of years under Biden is a large influx in migrants attempting over and over again to successfully traverse the border, be sent back, and then try again. Now, even though Title 42 has been lifted, now there's a 5-year prohibition, a 5-year ban once someone has been apprehended trying to cross illegally. And what the Biden administration is trying to do is trying to encourage migrants to follow legal procedures and come to the country by following the rules, and by increasing the penalty for those who come without any documentation. That's what's trying to discourage the cross-border flow. And so now if someone were to try to cross, unlike a few months ago, there'd be a 5-year ban before they could try again. And that seems to have at least temporarily discouraged the cross-border flow. But in the meantime, tens of thousands of would-be migrants are waiting just south of the border in Mexico. The situation is quickly becoming untenable south of the border. And a lot of smart people at all points along the political spectrum are very worried about what comes next. Now, by sending troops to the border, the Biden administration is sending a message that border security is of clear importance. That sends a very important message, not just to conservative, but to lots of centrist voters who, while a lot of Americans do support a more forgiving naturalization and legalization process for immigrants from other parts of the world, they do want to see stronger border security. So having troops at the border sends a very strong message, not only to conservatives, but to swing voters. But it also sends a message to progressives. And in particular, it sends a message to Latinos. And even though the Biden administration has made it clear that the troops they're sending will not be directly involved in intercepting the migrants, but rather assisting border personnel with their administrative functions. But photos and video of 1,500 armed soldiers at the border is going to send a very powerful message to Latino voters, too, and not a particularly helpful one. And these are voters who Biden badly needs to turn out in large numbers next year. How badly? Well, a recent Washington Post ABC News poll shows how much Biden has to rely on support from non-white voters. The Post ABC poll showed that Trump is running 6 points ahead of Biden among all voters. And while Biden still has advantages among both Black voters and Latino voters, those numbers also reveal a very marked lack of enthusiasm for Biden. Latinos prefer Biden by only 9 points over Trump. And a 55 to 45, 54 to 45 split among Latinos, even to Biden's advantage, is not enough to win a general election. Of even greater concern to the Biden campaign is when Latinos were asked which of the two most recent presidents did a better job of handling the economy, Latino respondents picked Trump over Biden by almost 20 points. So while Latino voters are very, very strongly object to Trump on the issue of immigration, they so prefer Trump on the economy that it's limited Biden's lead among a group of voters who he needs to win by very wide margins in order to get reelected. Now, look, there's issues like healthcare and abortion, like the pandemic, are also, like in the economy, as I said, are also very important to these voters. But polling shows that Biden's lead in the Latino community depends heavily on immigration-related issues. That's why he's beating Trump, given that Trump is doing so much better on economic policy. But once again, troops at the border isn't going to increase that support for Biden, either in persuading undecided Latino voters or motivating the much larger number of Latinos who would almost certainly never vote for Republican for president, but need to be motivated to turn out on election day. So Biden has to both persuade and to motivate this key constituency. And by putting troops at the border, my own opinion is he's doing just the opposite. But again, as I said earlier, it's not just conservatives, but it's centrist voters who want to see a stronger border presence. And so Biden can't afford to look weak on immigration either. Congressional Republicans have introduced a very aggressive border security bill, but even a lot of moderate Democrats are criticizing the administration for their lack of progress on the issue. And if that's coming from Democrats, from people like the governor of Colorado, Gerald Polis, the mayor of New York City, Eric Abrams, these are Democrats who will vote for Biden for re-election. But if they're publicly complaining about the administration on this issue, that shows you how Biden's work is cut out for him when it comes to attracting Latino support. Now look, okay, well, let's do this before we wrap up and bring in Rachel. I'm going to ask you another question. Just like I asked you several minutes ago, whether you thought the abortion issue would hurt Republicans, and you said that it would, and by very large margins. I'm going to ask you the same question, Katie, if you can help me out here, about immigration and the Democrats. How will the immigration issue impact Democratic candidates next year? And the same choices are the same as they were for Republicans. Is it an issue that will hurt Biden and the Democrats very badly? Is it an issue that will hurt, but only slightly? Will it have no effect? In other words, it'll balance out. Is it an issue that could help the Democrats, perhaps by increasing support, not just among Latino and Asian Pacific voters, but among others who want to see broader immigration reform, or potentially would help quite a bit? So Katie, how do we do on this one? What did our group have to say? Very interesting. 91% believe the issue is going to hurt Democrats. Almost identical, by the way, to the 93% who said that abortion would hurt Republicans. But what's different here is while most of you said that the abortion issue would hurt Republicans very badly, 71%, almost 3/4 of you, believe that immigration will hurt Democrats, but only slightly. And similar numbers say no effect or will help. So in both cases, the parties are confronted with a deep divide between their most loyal supporters on one hand and the more centrist voters who decide close elections on the other. And both Republicans and Democrats face a potentially unsolvable dilemma trying to reconcile such fundamental differences on such emotional issues, because the more either party plays to their base, the more they lose swing voters. The more they reach out to the political center, the less motivated their most loyal supporters are to turn out and vote. So these are really difficult decisions. Democratic candidates who adopt more restrictive immigration measures risk angering their party's most progressive voters. Republicans who attempt a more tolerant approach on abortion policy are going to infuriate their most conservative supporters. My own feeling is it's entirely possible that the party that angers their best friends more will elect the next president, because they'll be better positioned to reach out to that all-critical center. Last question, then I'll ask Rachel to join me. Katie, if we can put up the last one. Which party do you think will be hurt more by these issues? Will Republicans be hurt more on abortion? Will Democrats be hurt more on immigration? Will they both be harmed equally? Or will neither be significantly hurt? And Katie, when we have the answers on that, let's put it up. And then Rachel, I'll ask you to join me. Wow, this is a much more pronounced slant than we saw when the questions were raised individually, 65%, almost 2/3 of you, believe that Republicans will be hurt more by abortion than Democrats by immigration. That is roughly a 5-to-1 margin. 21% think both parties will be hurt equally, and 2%, a small, plucky number of you, believe that neither party will be hurt by these issues. All right, very interesting responses, but now I'm really eager to hear more of your thoughts in the form of questions or other types of input. So Rachel, if you're willing to come back on screen, let's see how we're doing for questions, huh?
Great. Thanks, Dan. Yeah, thank you all so much for submitting your questions. And of course, Dan, for being here. And I want to start with a question about abortion, which is the topic you started with as well. So this audience member says, abortion bounty laws in states like Texas and Oklahoma have granted private citizens the authority to enforce anti-abortion laws in exchange for cash. Is this still happening in these states, and how effective are those laws?
So at this point, those laws have been held up in court, and it'll probably be some time before they're resolved. So at least right now, they're not being enforced, but whether they will be or not is something that'll be decided in all likelihood, not by a state court, but by the US Supreme Court.
So also on the topic of abortion, an audience member asked, do you think that some of the fear around the issue of abortion is because people are afraid it could lead to additional rights being revoked?
What, it's an interesting question, and it's been an important part of the Democrats' argument on abortion rights. And my own opinion, arguing essentially that if this right is taken away, others, whether it's the right to same-sex marriage or other type of social and cultural issues, could be endangered as well. My own feeling is that the Democrats would be much better simply focusing this argument on abortion rights. As I mentioned earlier, polls have shifted so precipitously from being relatively balanced to being very strongly pro-choice, that what I learned when I was doing campaigns all those years ago is that when you have a 20-point advantage on an issue, you stress that issue. And so I think particularly for swing voters who might consider themselves as socially moderate generally, who have more recently come to identify as pro-choice for very practical reasons, it probably makes more sense to appeal to those voters on practical grounds than a broader philosophical argument.
Shifting to immigration, we have a ton of questions about that topic. So, as you mentioned, border crossings have decreased since Title 42 was lifted last month. Can the Democrats capitalize on this change?
Well, I guess two things. One, we don't know if that's sustainable. Although, as I mentioned earlier, the number of border crossings have dropped since Title 42 was lifted. The number of migrants massing just south of the border continues to grow. And so it's difficult to see how, for the next 17 months, this doesn't still turn into a much greater border challenge, both politically and in terms of real world impact. And so I think the Democrats would be taking a real risk to begin talking about a perceived victory on this front, knowing that it may not be sustainable all the way until election day. And once again, it's worth noting that the swing voters I talked about earlier, again, this is a sentiment not just from the conservative wing of the Republican Party, but from voters closer to the center also, is they want to see a stronger border presence. And so once again, in addition to the real world impact of sending troops in case there had been a border surge after Title 42 was lifted, the Biden administration was very aware that they were sending a helpful message, not a harmful one, to swing voters by enhancing border presence. So if I were running or advising a Democratic campaign, I would note that the border crossings have have gone down since the measure was lifted. But I'm not sure I'd put a lot of time and emphasis on it because voters do want to hear more, I believe, about security and achieving a balance on that front between their base and the swing voters means talking about both, but not stressing one significantly over the other.
So we've had a handful of questions come in about Ron DeSantis, so I want to start with this one. He recently signed some very controversial immigration laws in Florida. How might these laws impact his run for president?
Well, the short answer is that signing stricter legislation that more strictly discourages immigration is designed to help DeSantis in a primary. And his advisors believe will help him in a general election as well. But while I certainly agree with the first half of that supposition, that this helps him win a Republican primary, I think it's less clear that it helps him in a general election. Many of our audience members, Rachel, as you know, are based here in California. And over the last couple of days, the news media has been filled with stories about how the state of Florida, just like they sent numbers of undocumented immigrants to Washington, D.C. and to New York and to Martha's Vineyard early this year, have now sent 2 planes to Sacramento, California, with several dozen undocumented immigrants. DeSantis, again, believes, it appears, that will help him in a Republican primary. It's harder to tell whether it helps him in a general election is not. But before we go on, and before we assume that it automatically hurts him, it is worth noting that the Democrat, as I mentioned earlier, the Democratic governor of Colorado, Gerald Polis, and the outgoing Democratic mayor of Denver, Colorado, have also sent undocumented immigrants from their jurisdictions to larger states and bluer cities. Now, these Democratic office holders have done it in coordination with the mayors and governors in New York and Massachusetts and elsewhere, whereas DeSantis and the Texas Republican governor, Greg Abbott, have done this in a more confrontational way. But what we're seeing, if Democrats are coming to these kind of conclusions also, is that this is less of a partisan issue than a regional one. I think what the DeSantis campaign is gambling is, in addition to the certainty they believe with which this helps him in the Republican primary, that there are enough voters in purple states in the southern and western portions of the country that if DeSantis were the Republican nominee, it could potentially help him in a general election as well.
So we've also had a number of questions about the migrants that DeSantis flew to Sacramento. So this audience member asked, how will the battle between Newsom and DeSantis on immigration end?
My own opinion is that the broader fight between DeSantis and Newsom, not just on immigration, but any number of issues. We have dueling court decisions in Florida and California on how transgender youth ought to be handled. Both Newsom and DeSantis have visited each other's states to criticize the other on all sorts of policy matters, on education, on jobs, on handling of COVID. I don't believe the fight between the two of them will end until 2028, because it is almost certain that whether Biden is reelected president or not, that Newsom will run in 4 years the Democratic nomination. And in 4 years, DeSantis will either be an incumbent president running for reelection or a former Republican governor seeking the White House again. So either way, it's more than likely that we see both of these individuals running for president 4 years from now. And between now and then, or at least over the next 2 years before the two of them leave office, I think you'll see both of them looking for every opportunity imaginable to take shots at the other one. So that's not ending anytime soon.
So just a couple more questions about immigration. Does recent polling show that Latino voters want potential immigrants to enter the country legally and resent those who enter illegally? If so, does that mean that Biden sending troops to the border might help him with Latino voters?
It could potentially help them with some group of Latino voters. Generally speaking, not only Latinos, but Asian Pacific voters as well, tend to be more supportive of less strict immigration, of broader immigration reform than the rest of the electorate, simply because they reflect communities where the levels of immigration are much higher than other racial and ethnic groups. But there are subsets within both the Latino and Asian Pacific community. And what we found is particularly older voters, particularly older male voters whose families have been in this country for more than a couple of generations, they tend to be more likely to support stricter border measures. But when you look at female voters, when you look at younger voters, when you look at first-generation Latinos, the numbers skew very, very heavily in the other direction. Now, there's also one other exception to that, and we saw this in 2020, and it's something that DeSantis has benefited from in his campaigns for governor of Florida. Unlike California, the very large majority of Latino residents are either from Mexico or from Central or South America. In Florida, the majority of Latino voters, their families originally came from Cuba, from Nicaragua, and from Venezuela. And so while they do care about immigration policy, they're much more attuned to economic issues and more philosophical issues about communism and socialism. Both Trump and DeSantis have leveraged those debates to their benefit very, very skillfully. But to come all the way back to the questioner's point, there are subgroups of Latinos that support a stronger border presence and a stricter legalization and naturalization policy. But large majorities, both Latino and the Asian Pacific community, do support broader reform.
So we had two questions come in about judges. The first, has there been any progress in increasing the number of immigration judges? And the second, why don't we add more immigration judges to speed up the hearings?
Well, the Biden administration has been trying to add more immigration judges in order to speed up the hearings and taking other administrative steps to make sure that the process goes more quickly. And while I'd say that they've made a small amount of progress on that front, it's a pretty small amount. And so while it's heading in that direction, it's not proceeding at a pace where it's going to make a very large difference in the near to medium term future. So over the long haul, should these steps continue, ultimately we'll have a much more streamlined process, particularly for asylum seekers. But right now, we're just in the very early stages of that, and it's going to be some time before we see it on a broader basis and having a larger impact.
So I want to switch gears to a few questions we've gotten about the election in general. So this audience member asked, what impact, if any, do you think the candidacies of Robert F. Kennedy Jr. and Cornel West may have upon the outcome of the general election?
Well, it's hard to see either one of them doing much. Well, West is not running as a Democrat. He's running in another left-leaning party. It's very difficult to see a way that either Kennedy or Marianne Williamson, the other declared Democratic candidate, would prevent Biden from the nomination or even come close. That said, Kennedy is drawing roughly 20% in early primary polls. And a lot of that is based on just simply his famous surname. A lot of Democratic voters, particularly older Democratic voters, remember John F. Kennedy and Bobby Kennedy, is Kennedy's father, very, very fondly, and transfer some of that affection to him. But it appears, from my standpoint, that Kennedy's support comes less from his reasons having to do with his family, and more the Democrats who are skeptical about Biden, either for ideological reasons, because they don't consider him to be sufficiently progressive, or for age reasons, are simply looking for another alternative. And right now they're parking their support with Kennedy while they look to see if another candidate emerges. But whether it's Kennedy or Williamson or Cornel West, who just announced earlier this week, even though none of them are going to be the nominee, and even though it's hard to see any of them causing much of a problem for Biden, it reflects in all three of their cases a restlessness among Democratic Party progressives. It's worth remembering that in 2020, large numbers of liberal Democratic primary voters whose hearts belonged to Elizabeth Warren or Bernie Sanders voted for Biden not because they believed in him, but rather because they believed he was best situated to beat Donald Trump. Over the last 3 years, they've seen someone who they perceived as a centrist establishment candidate. They've seen him behave as a centrist establishment president. And while they've supported him on some things, they've been disappointed on others. And support for Kennedy or for Williamson or possibly for West is one way of exhibiting that disappointment. Most of these voters, and this goes back to the conversation we were having earlier about Latinos and immigration, most of these progressive voters, anyone who'd say that they're supporting Bobby Kennedy or Marianne Williamson or Cornel West, would never, ever vote for a Republican for president, not Trump, not DeSantis, not anyone else. The challenge for the Biden campaign is not to prevent these dissatisfied progressives from voting Republican, but finding ways to motivate them sufficiently to get them to vote. And once again, the more that Biden runs to the center to try to attract swing voters, as we've been talking about on immigration, the less likely he is to motivate progressive voters. Now, in 2020, the Biden campaign came upon a fairly simple and very effective strategy in this regard. They knew that Joe Biden couldn't say or do very much to motivate progressives, but they knew that Donald Trump would. And so while Biden was talking to the center, they used the threat of Trump as the way of motivating the Democratic base. And the question now is whether that will be as effective a tactic in 2024, when Trump's not in office, as it was in 2020, when he was sitting in the White House.
So I know you touched on this a bit tonight and in previous webinars, but the field just seems to be getting bigger. So this audience member asked, will so many Republican hopefuls throwing their hats into the ring help or hinder Trump's chances of winning the nomination?
Boy, that's a very good question. And I will tell you that the conventional wisdom, most political observers believe that that helps Trump. Because if you assume, and there's some basis for it, that there's a certain number of voters who will vote for Trump no matter what, but it's not a majority in the Republican primary, but rather a plurality, that the more Republican opponents to Trump who split that not Trump vote, the better it is for Trump. And of course, that's how he got the nomination in 2020. He didn't win majorities in party primaries until the very end of the process. But because the many other Republicans were splitting the non-Trump vote, Trump was able to win winner-take-all delegate processes with 30-40% of the vote. And the concern among many Republicans is the field splits that non-Trump vote again, similarly this year. I'm not as convinced of that, Rachel, and I will tell you why. Because to me, while that dynamic from 2020 is still in place, there's another one equally important, or perhaps even more important, one that isn't. And it's worth remembering that in 2020, almost no one thought that Donald Trump could be the party nominee, including Donald Trump himself for many months. And so what the other Republicans did, Ted Cruz, Marco Rubio, all the rest of them, is they all decided, I want to be the last candidate standing other than Trump. So I'm going to lay off of him. And therefore, by the time it comes down to one-on-one, I will be the candidate who beats Trump and gets the nomination. So it's odd to say that Donald Trump has ever snuck up on anyone, but Trump snuck up on the Republican field in 2016. They didn't expect him. That's not going to happen this year. We've already seen DeSantis making some fairly harsh comments about Trump just in the last week or two, now that he's become an official candidate. As I mentioned earlier, Chris Christie, the former governor of New Jersey, announced his candidacy today. And it appears that his primary motivation for being in the race is to take out Trump. So on one hand, splitting the non-Trump vote is still a danger for non-Trump Republicans this year. But the biggest difference between 2016 and now is that Donald Trump isn't going to get a free pass within the primary. And with other candidates criticizing him often harshly, and it's going to be a much more difficult road forward for him.
So I want to circle back to immigration for our last question. This audience member said some pundits and economists, oh my gosh, sorry. Some pundits and economists suggest that one of the elements associated with higher pay and perhaps in turn inflation is decreasing immigration. If this is true, which party could benefit from discussing the need for increasing recent immigration numbers?
Well, it's a very, very astute point. And one of the things we're seeing is particularly in countries with declining birth rates, that increased immigration could have a very pronounced and positive economic impact. And there are many economists who argue that one of the reasons that the US has avoided recession since the pandemic is because the levels of immigrants into this country has increased again, filling the open jobs. We've seen conversely what happens in so-called graying countries, in Japan, in Western Europe, when the population gets older and there aren't enough young people, native-born young people, to replace them in the workforce, their economies stagnate. So there is a pretty considered and fairly sophisticated argument to be made that increased immigration can be of economic benefit. Now, what it's going to require for one party or the other is to make that argument, but also to make it clear that they support an increase in legal immigration, not undocumented immigration. At this moment, Democrats are probably slightly better positioned to make that argument. But for those of our audience members who are old enough to remember the Nixon goes to China formulation, when Richard Nixon, the career-long anti-communist, became the president who opened China in a way that a Democratic president probably couldn't, the counter argument is that a Republican who has been more stringent on immigration policy might be better equipped to make that argument. The irony and the frustration to the question is an answer to the question is it's a correct argument, but it's a politically difficult one to make. And so while I think either party could make it effectively under the right circumstances, I can't really see either one making much of an effort to make that argument, at least not in the next year and a half.
Well, thank you so much, Dan, for this excellent analysis tonight. It's always so much fun to be on with you. And I look forward to seeing you again shortly for our members only session after the webinar, which if you haven't registered for it, you can do so by emailing Katie. But thank you so much, Dan.
Thank you, Rachel. And once again, thanks to our whole group for coming and joining us every month. It's always a lot of fun. I really enjoy it. And of course, Rachel, you and I will be sending out some follow-up questions next week or the week after to answer some of the questions we didn't get to today, right?
Yeah, we'll get to those additional questions. I know we had so many come in, so I'm excited for that as well.
Excellent. Well, listen, thanks very much, everybody. And I'll see many of you in the post-game show, or what my wife Cecile likes to call the after party, from 6 to 6:30. And as Rachel suggested, for those of you who haven't signed up for it in the past, I hope you're willing to sign up and join us in the future. Like this webinar, there's no cost involved, or you're certainly welcome to contribute to the LA World Affairs Council Town Hall. But either way, we're happy to have you with us.
Thanks, Dan.